PHI 203. You're welcome to study session 7, Ethical Utilitarianism. In this study session, we will take a look at an important consequentialist theory, ethical utilitarianism. We will discuss the types of ethical utilitarianism. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss ethical utilitarianism. 2. Identify types of ethical utilitarianism. Ethical utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a consequential ethical theory which sees morality in terms of the number of people affected by a course of action. This moral theory posits that the moral status of an action is measurable by the amount of non-moral consequences it brings about for those it affects. In other words, utilitarianism holds that only such actions which promote human greatest well-being are morally good and should be pursued by people. In essence, ethical utilitarianism advocates that moral agents should be neutral when considering the consequences that an action is likely to bring about. In this sense, therefore, what makes an action right is its effect or consequences on the overall number of people it affects or which it will affect, rather than the effect on the moral agents or some other persons considered alone. The idea of seeing moral rightness in terms of utility has been viewed in different ways by different philosophers. Hence, the question of what the utility or the favorable consequence that a good action is expected to have has been answered by utilitarian, alluding to the likes of pleasure, happiness, knowledge, self-realization, beauty, and so on. Bentham and Mill are hedonists who hold that what makes an action morally right is if it has a great balance of pleasure over pain. According to Bentham, pain and pleasure are the two sovereign masters that nature has placed men under. They are, as a result, the measurements for good and bad moral actions. One important challenge that utilitarians have faced has been the issue of the yardstick, which can be used in measuring utility. In response to this challenge, Bentham formulated the hedonistic calculus, a means whereby utility or pleasure and pain can be measured. In addition to the hedonistic calculus of Bentham, Mill also added the notions of quality and quantity to the assessment of pleasure and pain. The hedonistic calculus. Jeremy Bentham identified 7 criteria traditionally known as the hedonistic calculus. The hedonistic calculus is used in measuring or calculating pleasure and pain in order to determine whether pleasure overweights pain or not, in which case the outcome says whether or not the action is morally right or wrong. The criteria include intensity. This criteria deals with a view on how powerful or deep the pleasure that an action is likely to generate is. To this extent, therefore, whether an action is morally or wrong is a function of whether the pleasure is more intense than the pain, or the pain is more intense than the pleasure, which the action generates or is likely to generate. Duration. This condition for measuring utility is that which holds that in determining the moral status of an action in relation to the pleasure or pain it generates, we should consider the period of time in which the pleasure will be enjoyed or which the pain will be borne. In other words, whether the action is morally right will then be known as a result of looking at the period of time involved. Certainty. This refers to an instance whereby it is considered important to examine the dependability of the pleasure that an action which is considered to be morally good is expected to bring about. Put differently then, if the favorable outcome of an action in the form of pleasure is certain, then the action is morally right, but is wrong if the other way round. Propinquity. Propinquity is the condition which states that whether an action is morally right or wrong has to do with the how near or how remote the pleasure is. As a result, if the pleasure that an action is likely to bring about is near, then it is a good moral action, but is bad if the pleasure is remote. Fecundity. This particular condition is the hedonistic calculus, is that which maintains that for an action to be considered as being morally good, then its consequence in the form of pleasure must be such as is able to generate further pleasures. Put succinctly, a good moral action it is whose favorable consequence is likely to produce more pleasurable occurrences. Purity. In this sense, it is held that a morally good action must be that whose consequence in the form of pleasure is undiluted. This means that such pleasure must not be the kind that is mixed with some pain. Extent. On the final note, Bentham avers that for an action to be considered morally good, then the scope or degree of the pleasure that the action generates or is likely to generate must be considered. Apart from Bentham and Mill, some other recent advocates of utilitarianism include David Hume, Henry Sidgwick, R.M. Harry, Peter Singer, and Estin Rachel. There are three main types of utilitarianism. These are act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, and general utilitarianism. Types of ethical utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is the type of utilitarianism which holds that whenever we are faced with a moral decision, we should consider the moral action at hand in relation to the consequences it is likely to bring about. In other words, act utilitarianism avers that all that we need in determining whether an action can be deemed morally good or not is to determine whether the action in particular and the moment in time will generate a greater balance of good over evil. If the answer is in the affirmation, then the action is morally good. But if this is not the case, then the action is morally bad. For example, going by act utilitarianism, in case Alehiri wants to decide whether it is morally right to abort an unwanted pregnancy, all she has to do is to ask herself what the consequences is likely to be, that is, how it is likely to affect all the people concerned. In this case, for example, Alehiri might have to consider the likely consequences in relation to herself, the fetus, the man who impregnated her, and so on. If she realizes that the likely consequences of the abortion will bring about more good than evil for more of the people involved, then according to act utilitarianism, abortion is morally right for Alehiri to go for. Criticism of act utilitarianism. Although one important thing about act utilitarianism is that it acknowledges that every act is unique and distinctive, and so it gives room for flexibility according to the demands of the issue at hand. Yet, act utilitarianism is beset by a number of problems. The problems include: 1. It does not help in making quick decisions. There are times that we are faced with moral issues that need to be urgently responded to. At such times, the kind of time that we need to put into calculating the likely consequences of the particular action is not always available. 2. Also, we bring children up by giving them rules concerning what to do or what not to do, and concerning the type of individuals that we expect them to be. Act utilitarianism is on this note not relevant to children, as they generally lack the skills needed to do all the considerations for each action per time. 3. Another problem with act utilitarianism is that it loses sight of the fact that the entire consequences of an action are not always immediately evident. Going back to the example of Alehiri cited earlier, part of the short-term consequences might be that if she aborts the pregnancy, she will be free to go back to school in order to complete a degree program. However, a remote or long-term consequence might be that if anything should go wrong, she might not be able to become pregnant again in the future after getting married. In other words, one important problem with act utilitarianism is that since humans are not omniscient, it is difficult to know all the consequences of an action. Lastly, on the criticism of act utilitarianism, there is a serious problem of sincerity involved. This means that there are times that people, in spite of saying beforehand that an action is likely to benefit just a few number of people, they still go ahead with it. The question to ask ourselves is that in the absence of rules, can people be trusted to be reliably objective enough to do what will not benefit them, but which will benefit a greater number of people? Rule utilitarianism. In an attempt to remedy the shortcomings of act utilitarianism, utilitarian identify another type of utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism holds that instead of calculating the good and evil that are likely to result from each particular moral action, we should rather appeal to rules that are likely to bring more good than evil each time we need to make a moral decision. In other words, rule utilitarianism is of the view that whenever we need to make a moral decision, we only need to do so based on certain general rules which have over time been known to help us in doing what always brings more good than evil to the generality of all affected by such actions. This type of utilitarianism is better than act utilitarianism in that it is easier in teaching morality to children. Put differently, children who cannot calculate the likely outcomes of each moral action can easily remember rules earlier given them by adults with regard to making moral decisions. On the other hand, it saves time because it is easy to remember a rule like "thou shalt not kill," while it is not particularly easy to calculate the likely consequences of an action each time we urgently need to make a moral decision. Nevertheless, in spite of its strong points, especially in comparison to act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism also has a number of faults, which include: 1. Rules that do not admit exceptions do not always have a good consequences. If a moral rule does not give room for exceptions, there are times that the rigidity of such a rule will bring about an undesirable effect. Consider, for example, if a woman should be aware of a rule that "thou shalt not lie," and she is thrown into a dilemma in which case she has to choose between lying and saving her husband's life when another sin asks her whether her husband is at home. Issues like the example cited do not always occur. However, it is very true they happen at one time or the other, and it is obvious from our analysis of rule utilitarianism that it overlooks such issues with weighty consequences. 2. Rules are made from our observation of actual individual occurrences. Rules do not just emerge. More often than not, when we make rules like "do not commit adultery," it is because of the ill consequences of individual cases of adultery that we have seen in the past. In this case, therefore, we cannot really say that rule utilitarianism is successfully immune from all the problems that act utilitarianism has. In the same vein, if our formulation of moral rules is based on what we have observed in the past, there is no assurance that future occurrences will never negate or will always conform to what past occurrences suggest. This idea is strongly believed by Yoruba people who have a saying that "bí ò ní ṣe rí ọ̀la lè má rí bẹ́ẹ̀ ló mú kí babaláwo dífá ọ̀rọ̀ ọ̀run." This means tomorrow might not be like today, and that is why a priest inquire from Ifa, that is deity, every 5 days. General utilitarianism. General utilitarianism is the type of utilitarianism which posits that instead of calculating the likely outcomes of each moral action or looking for a rule whose consequences with regard to each action will be favorable, we should rather look at what the consequences would be like if everyone acts one way or the other in relation to the issue at hand. This means that for a general utilitarian, what to consider when dealing with a moral issue is whether the consequences will be good or bad if everyone should decide to carry out or refrain from carrying the action out. However, the problem still persists that how are we to know what the consequences will be if everyone should do a particular thing when in actuality everyone has not and cannot do the said action? Study session summary. In this study session, we considered the ethical theory known as ethical utilitarianism. Generally, utilitarianism is a consequential ethical theory which lays emphasis on the outcome of a moral action in determining the moral status of such action. Specifically, meanwhile, we looked at the act utilitarianism, which holds that the consequences of each action is what needs to be considered before the action can be said to be good or bad. Also, we examined rule utilitarianism, which purports that rules whose consequences produce more good than evil should be applied to in making moral decisions. Lastly, we looked at general utilitarianism as the last of the types of utilitarianism examined. We have come to the end of study session 7. Thanks for listening.